Today we are going to be discussing The Lamb by William Blake in his book of poetry, The Songs of Innocence and Experience, showing the two contrary states of the human soul. This is a book I recommend everybody buy. This is part of a series that I'm doing on the entirety of this book, which should only take you about 30 minutes to read and a lifetime to contemplate. And so what we're going to do today is, I want this to be a standalone video. So if you haven't seen anything before, great. But I hope that you will also go and watch the other videos that I've done and really experience this book of poetry as a complete work of art. Because like I said, it takes 30 minutes to read and it has a lifetime worth of contemplation in it. Now, this poem, The Lamb, is, I'll read it in a few minutes or in a second here, but I just want to set up something important about this. We're now really seeing in this fourth poem of this book, the mystical religious Christian belief system that William Blake has. Now, we're going to get through some of this in later videos, and we'll see this as we get the totality of this work. And then if you go more deeper into William Blake, you see more of this, that William Blake has a kind of agreement with Christian belief system in its deepest sense, but he wants to create his own system. His quote is, "I must create a system or be enslaved by another man's." And his idea is that the mythology, the stories we tell are made up by people, but that there's an underlying belief or mystical idea, philosophical, Christian, whatever, that, of the existence of God, of Jesus, that there's certain things that definitely in his mind are real, but it's the systems that are oppressive and repressive. Okay. So you see some of this in the poems we've already done. You'll see a lot of this as we go through. What I'm going to try to do today is read this poem to you and and give you a couple of the things that I always do when reading poetry to kind of help you get more out of poetry in this poem and other poems in the future. The main thing that we're going to do, as I always say, is the methodology is a simple process of reading the poem, rereading it aloud, and then doing what I call converse with verse. And afterwards, you can do a formal analysis if you want. But to me, those first two are the core of having a great literary experience, which is our goal. If you're a teacher, your goal should not be for your students to understand enjambment or a certain kind of metrical form. Those are great things you can definitely add to, and we'll have some things in the coursework. If you buy the course, there'll be some material to help you with that. But that's not the goal. That's a subsidiary, secondary, tertiary, whatever. It's not the main goal. The main goal is to help your students have a first great experience. This is from a book, again, called The Songs of Innocence and Experience. And my argument is that this book of poetry is the best first exposure to poetry that every English speaker and secondary speaker should have. You should have this. This should be the poem, the book. It will teach you everything you need to know about how to go into poetry. And it does it in an approachable way. This is easily readable English. You're now going to read through the poem and then reread it and then converse with verse. Okay, here is The Lamb by William Blake. Little lamb, who made thee? Dost thou know who made thee? Gave thee life and bid thee feed by the stream and o'er the mead. Gave thee clothing of delight, softest clothing woolly bright. Gave thee such a tender voice, making all the vales rejoice. Little lamb, who made thee? Dost thou know who made thee? Little lamb, I'll tell thee. Little lamb, I'll tell thee. He is called by thy name, for he calls himself a lamb. He is meek and he is mild. He became a little child. I a child, and thou a lamb. We are called by his name. Little lamb, God bless thee. Little lamb, God bless thee. So the idea here now is to reread it. I'm not going to reread it. I'm going to go jumping into the converse with verse. But the rereading part is really important for you. You do that before you really analyze it, before you go to Google or AI and kind of do an analysis, which is great to do, by the way. I'm not opposed to that. But the chief value that poetry and literature and art have is the training of your own consciousness. So it's a start where you are thing. This is akin to, going to Google and AI before you have an experience for yourself at the best level of wherever you are. I don't care where you are. If you're at a 3-year-old level, you're at a 3-year-old level. There's poems that I read where I feel like I'm at a 3-year-old level. If you're at a 103-year-old level, then you're at a 103-year-old level, where you are. And skipping this step, which I think a lot of people do if they even approach poetry, is akin to trying to train to run a marathon by going on a treadmill, but you put your feet on either side of the treadmill and you just let the treadmill go without you on it. That's essentially what's happening here, because this is the training of the mind in the same way going to the gym trains the body. So do that work. That's the whole point. So I'm going to model converse with verse. My converse with verse will be different than your converse with verse. But I'm trying to model this so you could see that this is a conversation that I'm trying to have with the poet to understand what he's trying to say. I'm not worrying about, do I understand it all? Just what comes to my mind, what symbols, ideas, imagery, anything. So right away, I notice little lamb who made thee. It's a question, even though he doesn't have a question mark, but he's asking a question. So someone is asking a question. Now, we saw in that image that goes along with this, and I'll bring it back after we do this, that there's a little boy talking to a lamb. So I have that in my mind. Little lamb, who made thee? So a little child, let's call him 4 or 5 years old, is talking to a lamb. Now, by the way, I think this is very realistic in a sense. Like if you've ever been to a farm or a petting zoo and you see kids talking to animals, they talk to them in the same way that they might talk to any creature, any human. So he's saying, little lamb, who made thee? Do you know? I always translate the dost, thous, and the these into, do you know who made you? Gave you life and bid you feed? So, again, it's not setting a question mark here, which is, you can think about why Blake, but there's a really odd, complicated reason why Blake does this, so we'll skip that for now. But little lamb who made thee, do you know who made thee? Gave you life and bid you feed. So again, it's set up with a question that the little child is asking, is what I'm getting from this. And he's saying like, well, where do you come from? Right. And who you feed you eat a certain way, you're living, you're mooing or whatever, you're making little lamb sounds. Is it a mew? Little lamb sounds. And, he goes on by the stream and over the mead, the meadow, is I know what that means. And that would be something that might trip up a lot of people who aren't used to reading poetry. You might think of that as like mead, like you drink, right? But it's actually short for meadow. If you think it's mead that you drink as you're going through this process, that's fine. That kind of misinterpretation is part of the experience of learning poetry, by the way. It's totally fine. Okay, but so the child is continuing like that you feed over the stream and the meadow, gave you clothing of delight. That's the clothing of that we get wool from. Softest clothing, woolly bright, gave you such a tender voice, like the sound of a little lamb. I think it's mewing. I can't remember the word now. Again, so I don't know everything. I'm just going off the top of my head. Making all the vales rejoice. So like the valleys rejoice with the sound of your voice. Little lamb, who made thee? Do you know who made thee? So the child is asking this question. I see that he is, I'm going to say it's a male child based on the picture, but it doesn't have to be. That he's also kind of drawing a pretty beautiful pastoral image. I see an image that I've seen many times before. Let me see if I can pull this up really quickly. So this is a painting that comes to my mind by Johann Baptist Hofner. I think that's how you pronounce it. And, so I thought of this painting, even though, again, little girl, so it doesn't have to be a little boy, but in this case, it's a girl. That's really irrelevant. The innocence is what's important here. It's this Songs of Innocence. And, there's such a quaint pastoral, this is so common of this era in terms of the scene that's occurring. And everything looks just so innocent. She's, the little girl is protecting or holding the baby lamb. You have the older lamb, probably the mother, either concerned or, trying to see what's going on. But that's kind of an image that comes to my mind. If you're teaching this is a good painting to go along with the poem itself. Okay, let's go back. Okay, so that's that first stanza. We're getting into this idea of who made the lamb. And you have this pastoral scene, by the scene, stream, mead, clothing delight. You have this beautiful image, this pastoral image of a shepherd or, little boy, little girl talking to a lamb. Little lamb, I'll tell thee, little lamb, I'll tell thee. Okay, so this is interesting, right? The little boy is going to explain the existence of a creature. So we're getting into basically a metaphysical thing. Like, this is pretty deep in a sense when you think about it. Like, you're telling, it's the little child's going to say, I know where you come from. The creator is called by your name, thy name, for he calls himself a lamb. Now, I know from my Christian mythology the idea of Jesus as a lamb. This is in the Bible. I don't remember the passage off the top of my head. That's really irrelevant. But I've heard and I know Jesus is often referred to as the lamb, the sacrificial lamb, things like that. For he calls himself a lamb. He is meek, right? The meek shall inherit the earth is one of the most famous messages from Jesus. He is meek and he is mild. He became a little child. So this is the God becoming the son, from God giving his son, which is part of his body, making him a child, and he grows up as, on earth, essentially. I a child and you, thou a child, we are called by his name. So now the child is self-identifying. He's saying that I am this little lamb, God bless thee, little lamb, God bless thee. So this is the engraving that if you buy the book, it comes in, it's easier to read than what's on my screen, I think. But what I think is really important here is, again, the simplicity of this poem. This is a nursery rhyme in style. So if you're teaching this book to, or reading this book to a 3-year-old or a 6-year-old, they can get an enjoyment just from the repetitiveness, the sound, little lamb, who made thee? Dost thou know who made thee? Gave thee life and bid thee feed. So in the first iteration of teaching this book, just allow the young children to enjoy the sounds and the images. And don't worry about the underlying meaning. That comes later when you teach it again. I recommended this in earlier videos, that you teach this book, which is easy to teach over the course of years, multiple times throughout a curriculum. That's how, so if you're a parent, this is ideal. Like, have this, read this to kids when they're 3, 4, 5 years old, then discuss it with them when they're 10, 12, 13, and then, get into some of the deeper ideas when they're 16, 17, 18. And that, I think, is a really good way to solidify the deep ideas of poetry that are in and can be in poetry. But one of the things you get right away, I think, is this idea of God and creation. And there's a kind of awe that the child has, unencumbered by anything outside of existence at this time. I shouldn't say existence. I should say anything outside of the relationship between these two entities, the child and the lamb. There's, they're out in a pastoral scene. So it's just the two of them. There's no mediating force. And we're going to get into mediating forces later, but we've already gotten a taste of that with some of the poems before. But right now, it's pure innocence. You cannot get more innocent than a little child, 3, 4, 5-year-old child, and a little lamb. That is and then Jesus, which is, the epitome of Jesus, of innocence, I think, at least representationally. And that's what I think is happening here. Is you're seeing this kind of question, or this. That's what I think you're seeing is this ideology that is becoming more prominent in this time period of the late 1700s, the 18th century, that is happening in the Romantic movement that we still have to this day. And so this is a more advanced discussion to have with your older students of the underlying philosophies going on and being represented here. Now, and that philosophy essentially comes from Rousseau and other thinkers at this time, which is the untarnished wisdom, enlightenment, thinking and abilities of a child, and also the noble savage idea. So these two ideas kind of come together in the thinkers of this era, and I think Blake is a product, or at least a disseminator of that philosophy. And the idea is that somehow this child has the direct relationship to the truth of God. And that I think is very important, is that the child is the one proselytizing that he knows where God comes from. Now, I think it gets more complicated as we go through this book, but I'm going to stop with that for the little lamb, because I think that's the important thing. So I just want to recap a couple things about this poem and how to teach it. So my methodology is very simple. Read, converse with verse, wherever you are. The third step would be go into the analysis a little bit deeper to the degree that you have time and effort and ability and time mostly. If you're teaching this, my recommendation is to teach it first when they're young and just get a sense of the sound and the rhythms and just the pleasant sounds that it makes. Little lamb, I'll tell thee. Little lamb, I'll tell thee. And that's it. And just read it to them. Let them read it aloud themselves. Let the children just expose themselves to this nursery rhyme, as a nursery rhyme. Then the second stage would be several years later, maybe 7th through 9th grade. You decide exactly when this is appropriate. And then you go into a little bit more of the story that's being told, and you could start lifting out with them some of the meanings. Have the children, the 7th through 9th graders, give a little bit of their own converse with verse, either in class together or, on their own written. Although I prefer out loud because I believe very firmly in one of the values that poetry allows for the teaching of students is to develop their out loud verbal skills. That's one thing it does. Prose and writing is a critical skill to learn, and it can be incorporated, but it's a secondary skill. This is, a verbal thing that you can help elevate the child's verbal acuity and abilities. And so have the child converse with verse. That means going through the lines, couple lines at a time, and explaining what they think they mean. You saw me kind of do this, modeling this a little bit when I was going through, okay, little lamb, who made thee? Do you know who made thee? So I'm thinking, who's talking to whom? What's going on? Okay, gave thee feed and gave thee life and bid thee feed. So I was talking about the questioning that I go through in my mind as hopefully modeling this a little bit for you. And then, in the later levels, high school level, you can talk more about the underlying philosophy of the Romantic era, the idea of childhood and innocence, the idea of nature as a kind of specific embodiment of goodness and the personification of and the representation of God through nature, which happens. So we get our first ecological movements and our first preserving of nature movements during and after and be caused by the Romantic poets and painters of this era. So I think the first national park is in the Lake District, which is where another poet, William Wordsworth, a Romantic poet, lived. And this is the idea of taking man out of nature, in a sense, or at least the untrammeled nature. So man will trample, he will restructure things And that's, that's something that's occurring. And so that's the underlying philosophy that I think is occurring here, is this idea of the purity of nature in and of itself. So rather than a 28-year-old or a 48-year-old man who might be a father, who might be a factory worker or something like that, we get a child unencumbered by all the societal things. So that's, I think, critical here for the older, when you get into the high school or even college level. And then I'm going to leave you with one image that we're going to return to in the course when we pair poems. So this is a book called The Songs of Innocence and Experience, showing the two contrary states of human nature. That's the title. So what I think is so great about this book of poetry is the fact that it has these little easy moments. So for instance, this is a simple nursery rhyme, but taken by itself and, together as a book of poetry, there's layers upon layers of complexity to be unraveled and discussed, which allows for a lot of discussion in class, great writing assignments, speaking assignments, and more. And to tease you with this, I'll just point out in the engraving that Blake did, and Blake he engraved it, colored everything, every single one of his books that he sold in his lifetime of Songs of Innocence and Experience. Notice the coloring of the clouds that are shaping this. So it's like there's this idyllic, perfectly lit, safe place enshrouded by nature, but all around it is this darkness. And you see this in poems that follow, like The Echoing Green, and you see more and more of this imagery of like this little child and lamb are kind of protected, but right around the edges is a darkness coming in. And we're going to talk about that as we move on. So please, if you have any questions, reach out to me at troubadour.studio or troubadourmag.com. Give me some questions you have. We're continually trying to make this course the best course possible to help you teach poetry in general, to have a first grade experience of poetry. Okay, see you next time.